not just more. We dropped 2 million tons in all of World War II, 500,000 in the Pacific and 1.5 million in Europe. We dropped 7.8, I believe, tons, 7.8, something like that, million tons of bombs on Indochina, starting that night. Now, the reason I know it was the same night that Mrs. Cheney was getting that news was that I learned later from Johnson's tapes when they came out 10 years ago. Reading the tapes of that period, I realized that while he was busy briefing Congress on the reasons for this raid and the raid he was about to take, just briefing them, not getting consent, advice, no debate, no nothing, just saying, here's what I'm doing, the decider, as Bush would put it. But this was an early instance of presidential decision, going to war. And I realized, reading this, that oddly enough, he was on the phone in between these briefings to the FBI and the people in Mississippi and to Martin Luther King and others, arranging how and when to tell the public the news. Actually, there was some delay in telling the public. But of having found these bodies, which was a very big deal. It was kind of amazing to think of him running these bombing raids on the one hand, dealing with this civil rights issue in the same evening, while he was so busy lying Congress into war. 3 days later, they passed the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which was in spirit somewhat beyond what the Senate passed yesterday on Iran, 77-22. Although James Webb, a Marine who was in Vietnam, pled with his colleagues not to do this again in terms of the Tonkin Gulf Resolution or the Iraq Resolution in 2002, that they would regret it for the rest of their lives, and that this was, like the Tonkin Gulf Resolution of August 7th, 1964, and what Morse called it at the time, an undated declaration of war, a blank check, meaning undated in the sense, we authorize you, we delegate you to decide when we go to war and why. It's up to you. Now, was Senator Morse one of the 2 people who voted against that at the time? Senator Wayne Morse of Oregon said at the time, this is unconstitutional. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which says that Congress shall declare war, not in consultation with the President or the President with the consent of Congress. That's not what it says for war. It says Congress shall declare war. And the history of that debate at the time makes it very clear that that didn't just mean announce formally we're at war, we agree with the President that we're at war. It meant that Congress shall decide whether to go to war. And the reason they said declare was that they did not rule out immediate reaction to an attack on our forces or our territory by the President. If there was no time to consult with Congress, if you had to go right now, the President has always been understood that the President could do that, and Presidents have done it many times, rightly or wrongly. And you could say that the Tonkin Gulf raids purported to be that, a response to an attack on our ships, to deter further attacks. But the resolution went beyond that. And to take, they shall repel any further attacks, and to take whatever measures he deems necessary against, I forget the exact words, but against aggression or against our interests in the Far East. A very broad blank check. And in 2002, somebody just took that one right out of the history books and changed the name to Iraq. Actually, not to Iraq, just to the Middle East, pretty much. And made it a blank check for Iraq, which they passed. Some of these same people. Hillary voted for both of those. And Kerry didn't, I think. Kerry voted against this one. 22 senators voted against it, nearly all Democrats, except for Hagel, who was leaving, unfortunately, leaving the Senate, Republican. So it's to the credit of the Democrats that they had 22. It is not to the credit of the Democrats that they had a lot of Democrats, including Hillary, who voted for that yesterday, despite James Webb's warning. Now, what was the basis of that warning? I mean, what was he referring to historically? As I say, I was in the Pentagon that night, August 4th, while Mrs. Cheney was getting her news I was getting the news from the president via the television as to why we were doing what we were doing, and from Secretary McNamara, who gave a press conference that night. Both of them described the situation as being retaliation for, quote, unequivocal, that's McNamara's words. The president took it for granted. McNamara later underlined all of this in secret testimony. Unequivocal, no doubt whatever. Like, remember, this just comes to me, remember Rumsfeld, these are not beliefs, these are facts. We know we not only know where they have WMDs, we know where they are. Cheney, there is no doubt. The president, there is no doubt, of the WMDs and so forth. It didn't happen to exist. They probably thought that there were some WMDs there that they would find in 2002, and they were unhappily surprised when there weren't any. But when they said it is unequivocal, there's no doubt, the evidence is conclusive, that was a lie. They were all lying. They all knew that it was extremely controversial, extremely ambiguous, contradictory, and thin evidence, which in the end turned out to be false. The indications, there were positive indications, but they were false. On the night of August 4th, there were indications that we'd been under attack. But there were a lot of counter-indications, such as Captain Herrick, after the 21st torpedo, sending a cable which I remember coming across that desk, and I'll never forget it, which can be paraphrased slightly as saying, hold everything. All the torpedo accounts except the first one are suspect, and later he said false, because a, quote, overeager sonar man was misreading the beat of the ship's propeller as an oncoming, as the ship took evasive action. And the ship's propeller against the waves in the water caused by the evasive action he was reading as successive approaches of torpedoes. So as Herrick said, they're all false, except the first one. For a number of years he maintained that there had been a first one. In the end that proved to be wrong, and he admitted it. So he was reporting that there was one, but even then, it was obvious to me, my little new GS-18, that you had to take his confidence on that point with a grain of salt, because he'd been just as confident about each of the previous 20 torpedoes. So had there been an attack? Well, maybe, perhaps, probably, at first. Unequivocally, it was a lie. Why did he say unequivocally? Because you're going to war. Just like the WMDs, you don't go to war because there might possibly be some WMDs. Some emigres think there were, although they haven't passed lie detector tests. Specifically, one is named Curveball on the biological warfare, and the Germans have said, don't trust this guy, he misses. We tested him on lie detector and he always fails. He was the source of the biological warfare thing, which Powell announced as having no doubt about in front of the UN. Okay, that's a lie by Powell. Another lie by Powell was, even I knew from outside, when he said Saddam Hussein is the #1 threat to world order and to the United States security. That was absurd. In a world with 20,000, 30,000 Russian weapons, very poorly guarded, with Pakistan weapons on the hair trigger and Indian weapons on the hair trigger, with Al-Qaeda in the world, with no connection with Saddam Hussein, as they knew well. Saddam Hussein, after 10 years of sanctions, with a totally shell of an army, this wasn't 10 years earlier, wasn't any threat to the United States at all. He could just as well have said Fidel Castro was the #1 threat. It's an absurd statement by the Secretary of State. A guy who could have had the Democratic nomination, snap of a finger, as well as the Republican, if he wanted.